Get ready, Staten Island. It's time to celebrate 5 years of Ferry Hawks baseball.
Tuesday, May 19th at 10:30 a.m., it's morning baseball. Wednesday, May 20th at 6:30 p.m., have a pawsome time at Bark in the Park. Thursday, May 21st at 6:30, it's Pride Night with $5 Bud or Bud Light draft beer. Individual game tickets start at just $12.
Visit ferryhawks.com now to lock in your seats.
Taxi! Okay, we're looking around.
This is the 77 WABC minicast.
With Walter Sterling, 800-848-9222. Alternative history. The more you and I explore the mysteries and the conspiracies that have brought us here, we learn about orphan trains, where 100,000 kids were removed from cities that had burned down mysteriously to way out west, no papers, nothing. And they were brought to cities that had trolleys, that had streetcars in 1800 and earlier, removed, gone. These were streetcars that connected cities like Columbus and Cincinnati and Cleveland. And just now, Amtrak's saying maybe we should have train service from Columbus to Cincinnati to Cleveland, or from Scranton to New York City just now. But no, those were already served by streetcars which were mysteriously removed. The expert on alternative history is Michelle Gibson. Michelle Gibson on the other side of midnight. Hi, Michelle. Michelle Gibson, an academic, an expert on alternative history. Michelle has the answers to many of our questions about what exactly was going on before 1900. Is a very different timeline and a very different history than we've been handed. In the past few weeks, and you and I have talked about this, we've been looking into trolleys, and I was stunned to learn that the trolley system was different than what I had been told. I thought it was an inner city connecting 3 or 4 blocks to each other, expediting people from here to there, but 2 or 3 blocks. It turns out, in many situations through the country, these trolleys were intercity trolleys. These tracks were laid down between Columbus and Cleveland and Cincinnati, and throughout America there were very long connections via trolleys. And this was erased. That story has been erased, even though those tracks are still lying there. Michelle Gibson, good evening. Tell us about trolleys.
Thank you, Walter, and I would love to, and that was a perfect introduction, because I think when we look at questioning the narrative and the history that we've been given since we were born about how things came into existence, there's aspects of the timeline that just don't match. And one of those is that rail infrastructure was starting to be built over long distances, starting relatively early on, let's say sometime in the early 1800s. And then sometime around the 1850s, we're starting to get trolleys coming in, streetcars. And that would have been around 1854, sometime in that time frame. And if you look on the internet, you'll see photos of the streetcars being pulled by horses or mules. And then within the next 20 to 40 years, they're getting electrified. And not only within large communities, smaller communities as well, on a scale that we can't even imagine, because all of that track is gone. All of those interurban streetcars are gone. And I think anybody who has any doubts about questioning our history truly needs to look at the subject of, where did all the trolleys go? And the railroad, for that matter, because passenger service existed during that same time period, let's say 1870-ish to, let's say, 1930-ish. Extensive passenger service on America's rails, when now we have Amtrak and not going to nearly all the cities that were covered before, and freight. And the rail that isn't being used for either of those more often than not, it's been turned into a recreational rail trail, which is cool. But why did they take that out? It doesn't make any sense. And I don't think there's any good reason for why that was done.
Well, what do you think
And
the bad reasons are?
There's number one would be corporate greed, which is the most obvious. But the not as obvious and the more insidious is that all of this rail infrastructure was part of an energy grid, a free energy generating grid. And so there was a highly advanced civilization that existed on Earth not that long ago that is completely removed from our awareness. And yet we live and work in the buildings and go to museums and theaters and in many cases educated in these old world buildings, and we're told a different story about how they came into existence, that they were built during that, let's say that same time period of sometime in the mid to late 19th century, early 20th century. And then in many cases, they're gone too. So with the example of the interurban streetcars, you have extensive city-to-city-to-city networks of rail that could go up to 50 to 60 miles per hour in between cities, on their fast runs. And places that still have those today, the Isle of Man has the Manx electric tramway, and you can see what it would look like if you go on YouTube and look for that. I think Japan has some lines that are still interurban lines that are functioning, and I'm going to do some research on that in the near future because I've spent the last year researching the entirety of the Great Lakes, and I've done all of them except this last bit of Lake Erie that I'm going to be starting on next. So I've gone from Buffalo, for example, to Toledo, and there was interurban rail all through that area. And you hear about the Lakeshore Electric Railway, and it was like called the greatest ever. And it's gone. It's been long gone. And you can find traces of it. You can find signs in the Huntington Reserve in Bay Village, Ohio, outside of Cleveland. There is a interurban bridge that you can actually physically see. It's not, it's not in good shape, but it's there. The same thing if you go further down in Vermilion. At the Rotary Park in Vermilion, there's a sign about this fantastic Lakeshore Railway, electric railway, right next to the river where this interurban bridge crossed over the river there. So you can find clues. You can find murals in towns. Here where I live in Prescott, Arizona, we've got the Marketplace Depot where the train station used to be, and there's a rail bridge right across the street where the Hilton is now. And there's signs in places all over town of the rail history. But if you didn't know to look for it or dial into that, you wouldn't even know that there were trains here. So all of that's been removed. I think, like I said, the first level explanation is corporate greed with the cars and the gasoline and the tires, all that's associated with that we talked about last time when you mentioned the court case. But another level is I think they're replacing the free energy grid with human energy, and that it's a way of harvesting human energy.
Now, the timelines. When were the trolleys correctly originally put on Earth? When were they originally tracked? When was this originally done? Does it match what the official story is?
No. There's an importance to this rail infrastructure that we know nothing about, and it would have been built by the original civilization that built the monumental architecture of our government buildings and courthouses and city halls and museums. A lot, if you look at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City in Central Park, it's a massive building. That's one that comes to the top of my head. massive building. This older architecture is built on a scale for much, much larger people. And
so you feel these were built by a different civilization, a different organization, different humans, different size humans?
Right, different size humans, 100%, Walter. It was built by a different civilization that we know nothing about, that's been deliberately removed from our awareness, that humans were much more advanced than anything that we've been taught with technologies that we can't even imagine. And that's all, you know, we're living on the ruins of this original civilization that's being kept from us.
And what years were those? What would you estimate when those constructions were made by the prior civilization?
It's hard to say because, you know, a lot of people talk about the 1,000 years missing from our history, you know, that they removed 1,000 years. So they've tampered with our perception of time, with the calendar, with who the original people were, which I call the John Wayne version of history, the cowboys and the Indians, and you know, people that are raised on the belief that that's real history, and it's just not. And it's all part of this cover-up, and it's been very effective. Clearly, it's been extremely effective. But there's a whole bunch of people that are waking up to anomalies and things that can't be explained in our surroundings that speak to this earlier civilization. And, you know, I can look outside the window where I live here in Arizona and see the remains of a megalithic stone wall. So I don't have to go very far to see that. And I think that's the case everywhere, actually.
And you feel the civilization was systematically wiped out to preserve a different timeline, a current timeline. Why do you think that was?
Why?
Why?
For power and control, ultimately. That explains the crazy upside world that we live in today, and a lot of the things that are happening when you look at issues around transhumanism and, you know, ultimately who's controlling the power and the resources in our world. And I think that was originally a benevolent entity, and it's not anymore. It's something with a very difficult agenda to realize all the energy and effort that's been put into this falsification of history and our the truth of our world. You know, it's been actively suppressed.
Michelle Gibson, alternative history expert. Michelle, tell me the name of your website and how we get in touch with you.
My website is piercingtheveilofillusion.com, and that's where my research is and my blog, and I turn all of my blog posts into videos, which are found at Michelle Gibson 8946 on YouTube.
Michelle Gibson 8946 on YouTube. Great videos. You have to go see them. Michelle Gibson, important contributor to The Other Side of Midnight. Thank you very much for being on The Other Side of Midnight.